Welcome to the Landmark Theater's Q&A podcast. In this podcast, you will hear a discussion with writer-director Robert Budreau from the film Born to be Blue, recorded at the Landmark West LA.
So the question was, what was the most difficult part about getting the movie together? The hardest part off the top is just putting together the financing and writing the script. I was the writer on the project, so I spent years writing it, and then I was one of several producers. And so the process of just getting an independent film made, as everyone knows, is very difficult. But once we actually got the money together, I think, finding cast is often one of the biggest riddles, and you need to have the stars align, you need to have schedules align. And so I feel very lucky that Ethan was available, and Ethan had come off. He was shooting a project in Toronto at the time that we made an offer, and I live in Toronto, and so we were able to spend a lot of time together. He's a very collaborative kind of artist actor, and so it really helped the process to be able to spend months and months with Ethan. And then when we were shooting, we shot this in Northern Ontario in October, November, when it was basically snowing and freezing outside, and we were trying to replicate LA in the 60s. And so I think, there was the challenge of doing that. And so we shot it all up there, and we came to LA for 2 days and shot in Malibu and Santa Monica. So there was the challenge of doing period California up in Canada on a very limited budget. So there was challenges at all different stages, I think. But Ethan was so passionate and such a sport that he made my job like a lot easier in that sense. He also challenged me a lot, I think, which was great. The question was, does Ethan sing or play during the movie? And the answer is yes. Ethan does all the singing. Those last two songs, Funny Valentine and I've Never Been in Love Before, that's Ethan singing. And he worked long and hard. He originally thought that because Chet has a bit of a strange, untrained voice, that it wouldn't be that hard. But he realized that it was extremely difficult because Chet kind of sings almost like he plays the trumpet, so his phrasing, his breathing is very unique. And we were very adamant about not trying to mimic and just kind of replicate the Chet Baker master, for example, of My Funny Valentine, which, he could have tried to just do that, but he wanted to invest some of it with himself and to improvise and to be a little different. So the trick was trying to capture the spirit of that, but be unique. So he did that, and then on the trumpet front, he learned to play the trumpet for 4 or 5 months, and he does little bits and parts of the trumpet playing. But that he would have had to train for 25 years to be able to even have a chance at it. So we didn't have that much time to prep. And so we pre-recorded most of the jazz with some of the best jazz players in North America up in Toronto ahead of time, and he learned how to play along to that. So the question was, how aware was I of Let's Get Lost? When I first started writing the project, I read everything, I saw everything, I watched Let's Get Lost endless amounts of times. And so I was aware of absolutely anything that was ever written or shown about Chet Baker. The only reason I wanted to do the project was I didn't want to do a traditional biopic from life to death. Bruce Weber already did that era, so I had no interest whatsoever in doing that. And so I really wanted to just capture a narrower frame. In this case, in the 60s, I was very captivated by this idea that he had this comeback, and that he had to, the fact. I think it's much more interesting to look at a character when he's lost everything and he's got to get it all back. In the 50s, he was on top of the world. He was the James Dean of jazz. It's cool to look at and to look at the photographs of William Claxton, but it's not that interesting a story. So to me, this was the most telling period for his life. And then when I was researching all the facts of his life, I came across this great bit of history that he was, in the early 60s, when he was serving time in Lucca, Italy, on drug convictions, he was approached by Dino De Laurentiis, who is Federico Fellini's producer, who approached him in prison and said, "Do you want to do a movie about your life?" And Chet said, "Yeah, that sounds great." And so they were going to do the movie. Chet wrote the soundtrack in prison. He came out, and the movie never happened. But I love the idea of kind of reimagining that it did happen, kind of like a Charlie Kaufman-esque kind of thing. And So the whole film within a film at the start is based on something that almost happened, but it didn't quite happen. And it also gave me more of an excuse to use black and white, which was really important to me because I think the visual iconography of 50s jazz is almost entirely black and white. I literally couldn't find a color photo of Chet Baker in the 50s. And so that's how I came to choose this kind of frame for the story.
Extreme back. Yeah, what was it like working with Carmen?
Carmen. So Ethan came on board this project in the spring of 2014. We shot it in the fall, I guess, of 2014. And then, so we kind of bonded and developed the script. And then the next, obviously, really critical part of it was finding a great female to act opposite Ethan. And it was really important for us to explore this issue of race, particularly in the 60s in America when it was such a big deal. And so much of the story is already about Chet trying to get the respect of his African-American idols on the East Coast, Miles and Dizzy. And the role of Jane is an intentionally composite type character, but it was important for us to cast an African-American or a mixed-race woman because Chet did have several mixed-race, either wives or lovers. And so we looked at lots of different people, and we just fell in love with Carmen. We saw, I was familiar with her work. She was great in Selma as Coretta Scott King and a bunch of other things. And we wanted someone that had a certain kind of beauty and maturity and intelligence that could kind of be a little bit stronger than the typical passive female that you often see in these movies, even though it's obviously not her film. And so she in a lot of ways had the tougher role being the one trying to support this guy who's not always the most sympathetic character. And she's kind of the vehicle for the audience. And so I thought she did a really great job. And it was very convenient because she lived in Brooklyn, as does Ethan. And so Ethan and I had already set up this relationship of collaboration where we were workshopping the script a lot in Toronto. And then when he was done his gig in Toronto, he went back to Brooklyn, and that's where she was. So then I would start going there, and I was able to work with the two of them there, which was quite nice. So the question was, is it true that Jane that was pregnant, and what kind of baby did she have? So the character of Jane is a fiction. She's a composite character that kind of loosely represents various women in Chet's life. And I think, even in the script, she's the actress playing his past lovers. And so it's very clear that she's a fictitious creation. And so to that degree, this woman doesn't exist, so there never was a baby. In real life, Chet Baker did have several kids. And so I guess in a loose way, it may or may not represent that. But I think it was part of my original idea to kind of treat this as a reimagining and try to remain true to the spirit of jazz and improvisation and not be strictly confined by facts. I find so many biopics in general, they do that anyways. Like even if you look at, I was listening to a podcast the other day from a history presenter looking at all the Oscar nominees that were biopics this year, and all of those films completely invented characters, completely invented all kinds of stuff, all the same things that kind of happen in this movie, but they present it as if that's exactly what happened. And everybody does it, and it's just the way you have to tell a story. It's part of storytelling. But we thought it would be interesting to actually celebrate the fact that we were moving away from facts, and I think it's hard to reduce someone's life to that. And when I did my research, I also realized that even Chet Baker would often tell a different story, like the incident of him losing his teeth, which is one of the biggest kind of mythologies in Chet Baker's life and a turning point in this movie. Over the years, he told wildly different accounts of what happened. So he didn't even really know what happened. And so there's a certain mythology to that. And so we took that as something we could take liberties with. It was that kind of aspect of the storytelling was one of the main reasons that Ethan was so interested in doing this, I think.
Can you talk about how the difficulty of acquiring the rights from the Chet Baker estate of music and permission to use it?
So Chet Baker, unlike someone like Miles Davis, who's very much an author and creative innovator, Chet Baker was an interpreter, so he never wrote any of his own music. So, and you'll probably notice from the songs that we chose, we tried to choose kind of more accessible songbook classics, but Chet never really wrote any of his own music. So he often would cover songs from the 30s and 40s from the American Songbook, like My Funny Valentine, Over the Rainbow, Summertime. And so the nice thing about that is that from a rights perspective, it means we don't have to worry about going back to Chet Baker writing anything. And because this movie is, as you've seen, so much about him trying to learn how to play again. Like, I never had any inclination to try to use Chet Baker master recordings. People often ask me, why didn't you use any of Chet Baker's music in the movie? All of his music, for the most part, is perfectly done, but this is a movie about a guy who's actually trying to play again. And so we had to have control over that music and design it so that at certain points he's actually not playing that well, or he's making mistakes and he's getting better. And so, I always wanted to re-record it all, and for all of those reasons, that was never an issue that we had to deal with.
In Chet's second career, his comeback, was he actually able to maintain a career?
In actuality, his comeback took a little bit longer. We've compressed the time frame a little bit, which is often the case. But after he had his big comeback in New York, he very shortly thereafter he did go to Europe, like the end titles say, and he basically spent the rest of his life on and off as a heroin addict without a real home in Europe until 1988, playing endlessly all across the world, but mostly in Europe. And he made a lot of his best records then. He recorded a lot, and so it was very erratic, the output. But some of his absolute greatest recordings are in Tokyo in 1987. There's some famous recordings at the very end of his career. And it's some of his most beautiful work, just because it's invested with the kind of pathos and experience and wisdom over the years. But he always had such a great ear, and because he always played in a very simple lyrical way, even when his chops weren't as good and he was getting older, he could still find those kind of ways to make it feel emotional. So a lot of people prefer his later period in the 80s, and some of the stuff from Let's Get Lost obviously is all his later period, which is, there's a sadder quality to it, but it's really quite beautiful. The question was, did Miles really say, come back when you've lived a little? And my answer is, I don't know if he said those exact words, but there's a lot of the research I did, it was very obvious that Miles had a real issue with Chet Baker and with the white West Coast sound. There was a show in the mid-'50s at Birdland, and Miles did go on record as saying that he thought that music was kind of like bullshit, and he totally shut Chet Baker out. And, Charlie Parker did take Chet under his wing, and he did call up Miles and say, there's a little white cat on the West Coast going to eat you up. That's a direct quote. So I think, Miles is obviously just a tiny figure in this, and he comes off in a certain kind of negative way because that is really how he felt at that time. I think over time they had a little bit more of a relationship, but Miles didn't really care about Chet, and it's funny because something that Ethan has been saying a lot, because we've been doing a lot of promotion for this movie, is that there's another movie that Don's doing, which is coming out soon, about Miles Davis, and Miles is in our film, but Chet is definitely not in the Miles Davis movie, because in a lot of ways Miles is just on another level, not necessarily musically, but just as an innovator, but to answer your question, yes, that is the way that Miles felt about Chet, especially in the mid-'50s. So the question is, who played on the trumpet tracks? So the trumpeter was a guy named Kevin Turcotte, a Canadian-based trumpeter who did all the trumpet, including Chet, but also Miles and Dizzy. I worked with a guy named David Braid, who is one of Canada's and one of North America's best jazz pianists and composers and band leaders. David and I, the very first film I did out of film school many years ago was a 1940s jazz movie called Dream Recording, and I worked with David on that movie. So it was really nice that 10 years later, whatever it was, when I did this, I could call him up, and we already had a very good relationship. And he was able to help me put together all the music for this movie. And then we had Terry Clark on drums and Steve Wallace on bass, both of which who played with Chet Baker in the 80s. So it was nice to have a few guys in the band who played with Chet, who could tell me some funny stories and who really got it. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I guess for those who didn't hear, she was just asking about the stance we took on addiction. And I think it has been something that's come up several times, is the fact that I think it was important that we weren't being too judgmental about addiction, because it's so easy just to say drugs are bad, people are bad, and there is a certain Hollywood trend where in a movie, you know, the musician overcomes drugs and it's bad, and then he ends by being clean. And that's not true to what happened with Chet Baker, but I also think it oversimplifies the case. And if Ethan were here, and he wishes he were, but he's been doing insane amounts of press, so he had to be in New York. You know, Ethan feels very strongly about that, and felt very, very strongly about this idea of trying to, you know, not oversimplify the issues of addiction, because Ethan was very close to River Phoenix, was very close to Philip Seymour Hoffman, and so he had a lot of personal experience with people who've, you know, he's close friends he's lost to heroin, and I think for him it was really important to not be judgmental about that, but try to kind of put love into it, even though we all know it's bad. I mean, that's easy to say. And at the end of the day, you know, I think drugs and heroin especially in the 50s and 60s within that jazz world that was just part of what it took to be a jazz artist. And Chet it's just like a young kid wanting to be like the other kids. He wanted to be like those guys, and it was kind of like a badge of bebop. If you wanted to be part of that gang, you had to do that. And so it was, you know, and obviously Chet Baker's not the only one, but he was one of the first hardcore kind of heroin addicts in terms of the legacy of rock and rollers, and then there's been many, many since.
I know it sounds like you're very interested in jazz. You've done an extensive amount of research, particularly into Chet Baker. So was the motivation to tell a portion of a story as a biopic, or why Chet Baker in this instance? It seems like there was a kind of larger message than just this man was significant, because we have Charlie Parker, we have Miles Davis. Is it that his story wasn't told in a more contemporary sense?
I personally always loved jazz, and I thought that his type of music, which I thought was a bit more accessible. Like, I love bebop, but bebop is a very complex music, almost designed to be niche and not accessible to audiences. And you know, Clint Eastwood already did Bird. So I was very attracted to Chet's story, because I also thought that just as a character, he's very interesting. He has these inherent contradictions. He's this square Oklahoma farm boy who then suddenly becomes this kind of prince of cool. And, you know, he sang all these very romantic love ballads, yet he had extreme difficulty kind of really engaging in proper loving relationships. And also his story, especially the frame that I wanted to tell, allowed me to explore kind of universal issues of addiction and race that I think are still very relevant today. And this whole idea of a good-looking white guy trying to idolize or appropriate African-American music, I think I've always been a fan of people like Elvis, and there's a long tradition of that in music, not only jazz. And I've just been a kind of an audiophile all my life, and so I think being able to explore the story, his story in 60s America, and knowing that character, I thought would be appealing. And there's a certain romance and mystery, I think, to his music. He was a very enigmatic guy who kind of, a lot of people, I think, projected onto him. And so you go down the rabbit hole, and it's very easy to get sucked into Chet's kind of vortex. And as a writer, that's what happened to me. I got sucked into that story, and it just became something that I really wanted to do. So the question was, she was saying, as a director, I like to give freedom to the actors, and do I recall any improvisations? And I think, the short answer is a lot of the script I evolved with Ethan, and there were certain scenes in particular, like the scene at the end in the dressing room, that I intentionally pushed him to try to come up with some of his own things, and we tried to rewrite. And I wanted to keep the tone of the movie feeling kind of a little off kilter and organic, and I really wanted to invite Ethan in because Ethan, I knew that he had worked in a very collaborative way with Richard Linklater on a lot of his movies, and he co-wrote a lot of them with Linklater. And very early on, I realized that's the way he liked to work, and I knew that I would get the most out of him by working in that kind of way, and it just happens that I love to work in that way too. And so he was just a huge resource. I think you're kind of foolish to think when you find an actor that is willing to give that to you, if you shut that down, you're going to shut the actor down. I know on the previous film he was making, it was the exact opposite process. He wasn't allowed to change one syllable of one word. He was just treated like a cattle and told to just do this, do that, don't even tell me anything. And he didn't enjoy that process. And he didn't do his best work. And so I think ultimately it's just about doing what I think is going to create the best work. And especially on a jazz movie, I think you have to work in that kind of way. And Ethan has written and directed himself, and he's kind of like a Renaissance man. So I think you're insane not to take advantage of that.
I know how long it takes to make a movie today, conception, getting it in the can. Were you on schedule and on budget?
Yeah, we were absolutely on schedule, on budget. We shot for 25 days, which is pretty tight. And our budget was fairly modest. I still felt good about it, but it was fairly modest. I mean, I think a lot of it is just really being well prepared. I also had a DP, Steve Cousins, who likes to light very naturally, and so he moved very quickly. A lot of times it's the director of photography, the cinematographer, who can sometimes dictate the pace, and he's able to create beautiful images with very little light and move very quickly. So no, we didn't. The whole project took a long time because it takes forever to write these things and put them together, but the actual production of it happens so quickly that it's over before you know it. You just start to kind of enjoy it, and then it's gone. And then, we spent about half a year in post-production. We did that in London actually for financing reasons. So it felt like a long process, but the actual production period was very tight, and we were able to. We kind of had to keep it on time and on schedule just because of resources.
I'd like to thank you for the movie, and I would like especially to thank you for the time that you have given tonight.
You're welcome. Thanks everybody.